Sound of shattering crystal cut through the low murmur of the grand reception hall, but the crash that followed wasn't the champagne flute. It was a body, wide, heavy, and completely unplanned, hitting the cold marble floor between a raised hand and a frail old woman's face. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And Rosie Flanagan, lying on her side in a crumpled heap with one shoe half off and a smear of blush wine already soaking through her white uniform collar, had absolutely no idea what she had just walked into. Rosie had needed the job the way drowning people need something solid to grab onto. Not gracefully, not with dignity, just desperately. She was 26 years old, originally from a 2-stoplight town outside of Thunder Bay, Ontario, with a mother on a waiting list for a specialist she couldn't afford, and a landlord in Toronto who had already slipped 2 notices under her door in the same month. She was not glamorous. She was 5'4" and 270 pounds, with thick forearms that had spent the better part of 3 years hauling laundry carts at a Holiday Inn before that contract dried up along with everything else. She had answered the private listing through a hospitality staffing agency. Temporary event staff, it said. Formal dress code required. Hourly rate. The rate was almost 3 times what she'd made at the hotel, which should have been the first sign that something about the arrangement was not entirely straightforward. Second sign was the NDA she signed before she even knew the name of the employer. Third sign, in hindsight, was the way the estate's head of operations, a lean, expressionless man named Gerald, who smelled faintly of gun oil, walked her through the kitchen entrance and told her without blinking that if she ever repeated anything she heard during the event, she would find her memory of the evening had become very inconvenient. Smiled and nodded and told herself it was probably just a wealthy family that valued privacy. A lot of rich people valued privacy. She had not imagined this level of wealthy or this level of family. The Vance estate sat on 40 acres outside of Oakville, hidden behind a wrought iron fence that stretched so long along the rural highway that Rosie had lost count of the fence posts from the passenger seat of the staff van. The house, if calling it a house wasn't an insult to the word, was white stone and old European architecture with wings that branched off the main body, like a cathedral that had lost track of its own blueprints. Inside, the floors were pale marble and the ceilings were painted. Not wallpapered, not panelled, painted, with figures and clouds and gold leaf that caught the light from chandeliers so heavy-looking Rosie had quietly stepped to the side when she first walked under one. Julian Vance was a name she had heard before, the way people hear the names of storms before they arrive. He was 41, Canadian-born to a father who had built a legitimate shipping empire before dying under circumstances that the papers in 2009 had called unexplained, and a mother who had come from old money in Lyon and never let anyone forget it. Julian had inherited the shipping company, expanded it, diversified it, and somewhere in the fold of those diversifications, the family had become something that no one discussed in specific terms, but everyone in certain circles understood completely. He did not look like what Rosie had imagined powerful men looked like. He was tall, yes, broad through the shoulders, in the way of someone who had spent a great deal of time being physically useful rather than decorative, with dark grey beginning to thread through brown hair that he did not bother to disguise. His face was not handsome in the way of men in advertisements. It was something harder than that, considered, like a room that had been arranged very deliberately and would notice if you moved anything. Rosie had seen him once from across the length of the reception hall before the evening turned. He had been standing near the east window with a glass of something amber, listening to a man in a navy suit speak with the attentive stillness of someone who was collecting information rather than enjoying a conversation. He had not laughed. He had not smiled. He had nodded once, and the man in the navy suit had gone quiet, as though nodded off a stage. Rosie had looked away and gone back to making sure the canapé trays were warm. The event was described to the staff as a private charity reception. 40 guests seated dinner followed by an open reception in the main hall, but anyone paying attention, and Rosie had always been, despite everything, a woman who paid attention, would have noticed that the guests did not have the soft, preoccupied energy of people attending charity events. They moved carefully, they watched doorways, they held their conversations in pairs and trios, rather than the open, overlapping clusters of people who were simply having a pleasant evening. 2 of the men near the foyer entrance were wearing jackets that hung slightly wrong on their left sides. It was not a charity reception. It was a summit of some kind, dressed in linen napkins and florals. Rosie carried trays and kept her head down and tried not to catch anyone's eye directly, which had always been her instinct in rooms where she felt acutely, physically out of place. At the hotel, she had learned to move the way she imagined she wasn't there. Efficiently, quietly, eyes on the task. It was harder here, because the other servers were all cut from similar cloth. Young, angular, moving with the casual ease of people whose bodies had never been a topic of conversation in a room they were standing in. More than once, she'd had to squeeze through a gap that the other staff moved through without a second thought, and the heat that rose to her face in those moments had nothing to do with the kitchen. She did not know who the woman was, at first. She had noticed her earlier in the evening. Difficult not to, because the woman existed in the room like a shout in a library. She was perhaps 65, small, boned, with silver hair pinned up elaborately, and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent her entire life being looked at from across rooms, and had decided long ago to give people something worth looking at. She wore black, something simple and long that likely cost more than Rosie's rent, and she moved through the reception hall with the confidence of someone who had hosted this kind of evening many times. Julian Vance touched her arm once, briefly as he passed, the unconscious, instinctive contact of someone reaching for something they are in the habit of protecting. His mother. Even without knowing anything else, Rosie understood that. Later learned her name was Elise Vance. She had come from France at 23, married into the Vance family at 25, and outlasted a great deal of things that should have broken a person of finer composition. She had also, in the past 2 years, been quietly and carefully losing the map of herself. The dementia moving through her memory, the way fog moves through a harbor, slow and total, obscuring the landmarks one by one. The staff were not told this, but Rosie had spent 3 years watching her own mother fight for clarity through medication side effects and bad days, and she recognized the signs the way you recognize a language you grew up hearing without formally learning it. She'd noticed them in Elise within the first hour. The way the older woman's eyes went briefly, completely blank. When a guest addressed her by name, the half-second of searching before the smile arrived. The way she held her wine glass without drinking from it, the way she kept turning, just slightly, toward the hall, the pull of somewhere quieter, somewhere less loud. Around 9 in the evening, Rosie glanced toward the place where Elise had been standing and found an empty space, and set her tray down on a side table near the kitchen entrance. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She told herself it wasn't her business. She was here to carry food and not break anything. Went to look anyway. The main hall was clear, the east sitting room was empty. She checked the corridor that led toward the library, and then the one that angled toward the rear of the house, toward the solarium, a long glass room along the back of the estate, filled with potted olive trees and low sofas, and the kind of winter light that came through glass and felt like a kindness. She heard voices before she reached the door. And first was Elise's, quiet, confused, and frightened. The second belonged to a woman, Rosie, recognized from the reception hall, the one who had been introduced during the welcome remarks as a representative of a partner organization, and whose name Rosie hadn't retained but whose presence she had registered, the way you register a dropped temperature. She was perhaps 35, sleek-haired, wearing a gown the color of champagne, and she had spent the better part of the evening positioned very close to Julian Vance without ever quite touching him. And Rosie pressed against the wall outside the solarium door, which stood ajar. "Don't understand what's happening to you," the woman, Rosie would later learn her name was Vera, was saying in a tone of voice that was technically pleasant and genuinely cruel. "Your mind is going. Everyone knows it, even if Julian refuses to admit it out loud. You're an embarrassment to him, Elise. You walk into rooms and forget why you're there. You say the same thing twice in one conversation. The people in that hall tonight, half of them are laughing at you." And voice came back thin and trembling. "I want to go back. I want Julian." "Julian is busy. Julian is always going to be busy. That's why you need to listen to me." There was a pause, and the quality of the silence changed. "The arrangement we're proposing is very clean. A private care facility. Beautiful, actually. You'd have your own wing. And Julian would be free to— I'm not going anywhere." Elise's voice strengthened briefly, the steel beneath the softness surfacing. "This is my home, my son." "Yeah, your son does not need his mother, wandering the halls and making scenes at formal events." Vera's voice had dropped the pleasantness entirely now. "He needs a partner who can help him manage what he's built, not a liability who forgets the names of the guests." There was the sound of movement, something brushing against furniture, and then Elise's voice came back higher and frightened, and there was the unmistakable sharp sound of a hand rising. Not landing yet, but that specific, awful shift in energy that precedes it, the held breath before the strike. Rosie did not make a decision. Decisions require a moment of deliberation, however brief, and she had none. She pushed the solarium door open with her shoulder and walked in. Moved too fast for her footing. The edge of the brass threshold caught the toe of her flat, and her weight and momentum did the rest. She pitched forward, broad and unstoppable, and threw her body sideways between the raised hand and the older woman's face. Vera's palm connected with the side of Rosie's head just below her temple. The crack of it was enormous in the quiet room. Rosie went down hard, her hip catching the edge of a clay pot, scattering dark soil across the pale stone floor. She lay for a moment on her back among the scattered dirt and broken pottery, her ear ringing like a struck bell, her vision doing something complicated and unwelcome. "What," Vera said very quietly, "is this?" Elise was already on her knees beside Rosie, faster than a woman her age and constitution should have been able to move, the instinct overriding the fragility. Her hands hovered over Rosie's face, not touching, the helpless gesture of someone who wants desperately to fix something and does not know how. "Bleeding," Elise whispered. "Oh, sweetheart, you're bleeding." Rosie raised her hand to her temple. Her fingers came away dark. Vera stood over them both. Her hand was shaking, not from remorse, but from the particular fury of someone whose plan has been interrupted by something they cannot immediately categorize. She looked down at the large woman in the stained white uniform lying among the broken pottery, and her expression moved through several stages before settling on contempt. "Stupid girl," Vera said. "Do you have any idea who I—" Vera. Word came from the doorway. It was not loud, it was not even sharp, it was simply said the way a door is closed, with finality and without ceremony. Julian Vance stood in the entrance to the solarium. He was not alone. Behind him, slightly to the left, stood a large man in a dark jacket who had the quality of stillness that Rosie had noticed on 2 others earlier. In the evening, Julian's gaze passed over Vera with the brief, complete attention of someone completing an inventory. Then it moved to his mother, kneeling on the floor, her silk hem darkening with soil. Then it moved to Rosie, crossed the room in several long, unhurried strides, and lowered himself to one knee beside her. He pulled a folded handkerchief, white initialed, from his breast pocket and pressed it with careful, steady pressure against her temple. His hands were not the hands of a man who had spent his life behind a desk. Rosie looked up at him. He was very close, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, and the way his jaw was set with something that was not quite anger, because anger is a thing that moves, and what she saw in him was entirely still. "You able to speak?" he asked. "Yes," Rosie said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Did she fall?" he asked, "or were you struck?" He held his eyes for a moment. The honest answer and the careful answer pointed in the same direction, which was unusual and made it easier. "He was going to hit your mother," Rosie said. "I got in the way." The muscle at the hinge of his jaw moved once. He looked over his shoulder at Vera. Ian. What Rosie saw in his face in that moment was not something she had words for. Not immediately. It was the expression of a man who had already arrived at every conclusion there was to arrive at, and was simply waiting for the situation to catch up to his decision. "You have," Julian said to Vera, "approximately 2 minutes to leave this property." Vera opened her mouth. "I would not," Julian said, "finish that sentence." Finished it anyway. Something about her father, about partnerships, about what it would mean for the arrangement. Her voice rose and then cracked, and Julian did not move, did not alter, did not respond. He simply waited in the way that large, absolute things wait, until she ran out of words. Then he looked at the man in the doorway, who nodded once and stepped aside. Vera left. Her heels echoed down the corridor, frantic and diminishing. The man in the dark jacket spoke briefly into a phone. Julian turned back to Rosie, who had managed to sit up against the base of the nearest planter, her head swimming, Elise's small hand wrapped around her wrist. "You stand?" Julian asked. "In a second," Rosie said honestly. "Sure." A faint expression crossed his face that might, under other circumstances, have been the beginning of something like approval. Called a name toward the doorway. Within minutes, a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Arsenault arrived. Unhurried and precise in the way of someone who had been on call in this house before, and knew the protocols. She examined the cut at Rosie's temple with a penlight and clean gauze, and efficient, quiet commentary. The laceration was not deep enough for surgery, but significant enough for 8 stitches, she said. And then she prepared a suture kit from the black bag she had apparently brought with her, which Rosie found simultaneously impressive and deeply alarming. It was during the stitching that Julian came back into the room. He brought a glass of water and set it on the planter ledge within Rosie's reach without comment, and then stood nearby, not hovering, just present. Liz sat on the low sofa across from them, quieter, now her hands folded in her lap, watching Rosie's face with an expression of concentrated, steady concern that Rosie recognized. Her own mother looked at her like that sometimes. "Found me," Elise said to Julian, not loudly. "I was confused. She came and found me, and she sat with me until I was." She paused, touching her fingers lightly to her temple in a mirroring gesture. "She has been finding me all evening, Julian," she noticed. Julian looked at Rosie for a long moment over his mother's head. Rosie looked back at him. "She reminded me of my mum," she said. "That's all." It was not all, but it was the part she had words for. 3 weeks later, Rosie was still not entirely sure how she had arrived at the situation of sitting in a private recovery suite in the east wing of the Vance estate, which was a sentence she had not expected to assemble in her life. Night of the reception had not ended when Vera walked out. It had, if anything, shifted into a second chapter that moved with the terrifying efficiency of something very organized, coming fully undone. Rosie learned later, from Dr. Arsenault, who was not precisely forthcoming but was honest when asked directly, that Vera Kellner had not arrived at the Vance estate as a business representative in any legitimate sense. He had come as an instrument of a broader arrangement involving a man named Soren, who controlled logistics networks through 3 provinces and had been operating in careful proximity to Julian Vance's interests for 4 years, looking for a specific kind of opening. The plan, as it eventually came to light, had involved Vera securing a position of proximity to Julian, facilitating the quiet removal of Elise, whose presence apparently complicated certain transitions of authority, and then leveraging her access to push a consolidation that would effectively hand Soren's organization control of 2 of the Vance shipping routes. None of this, Rosie thought, explained why Vera had been wearing a signet ring on her right hand with a profile sharp enough to cut. The cut at Rosie's temple had needed the stitches, and the headache had been significant and extended, but the thing that sent Dr. Arsenault to Julian with a very controlled expression was discovered later. A synthetic compound in the wound trace not from the ring's metal, but from a coating on the outer face of the stone setting. It had entered through the laceration. Her blood work came back flagged. It was not, by the doctor's assessment, the dose intended for Rosie. It had been sized for someone else, someone lighter, more precisely, and her body's mass and the general stubbornness of her constitution had slowed the absorption considerably. He had been sick for 4 days. Julian had been there for most of them. Indeed, not always in the room. He was not, she gathered, a man who sat still well, but present in the wing, stopping in twice a day with the same economy of fuss that he had applied to the glass of water on the night of the reception. He did not ask how she was feeling in the performative way of people who are making a gesture. He asked what the doctor had said that morning, and whether the headaches were the same or worse, and when she said worse, he went out and came back with the information that her dosage of the antitoxin had been adjusted. On the 5th day, when she was sitting up and coherent and deeply aware of the fact that her hair had not been washed properly, and she was wearing a recovery suite robe that probably cost more than her jacket at home, he sat on the chair beside the bed and told her what they had found. Told it plainly. He did not dress it up. Rosie listened to the whole of it, and then said, "So she was planning to poison someone?" Yes. I got in the way of that too, without knowing. Julian held her eyes. Yes. Absorb this for a moment. I don't know if that's funny or just extremely typical of my life. Something shifted in his expression that she had not seen before. It was brief, but it was there, a flash of something unguarded, something that had not been calculated into the composition. The situation with Vera and Soren has been resolved, Julian said. Rosie did not ask what resolved meant. She thought she understood, and she also thought she did not need to know the specific terms. "Mother has been asking about you every day," he added. "It's kind," Rosie said. "Is," Julian agreed. "She's also right about people, with a consistency I've found increasingly reliable." It without effect, looking toward the window. The winter light came in pale and clean through the glass, and made the room feel, briefly, like a kinder version of the world outside it. Rosie looked at him for a long moment. He was not an easy person to read. She had gathered that fairly quickly, but she had spent a great deal of her life learning to pay attention to things other than the obvious, to the silences between what people said and what they meant, to the way people moved in rooms when they thought the movement was unremarkable. Thought about what Elise had said that night, in the quiet aftermath, while Dr. Arsenault packed her bag, and Julian stepped into the corridor to make calls. Elise had been sitting beside Rosie on the solarium floor, the soil still on her skirt. Her hand still wrapped around Rosie's wrist, she had leaned close and said, very softly, "He has not looked at anything the way he looks at you in a very long time. I notice these things, even still." Rosie had said, "You might be mixing me up with someone." Elise had said gently, "I'm not." Yeah. Now, in the quiet of the recovery suite, Julian stood from the chair. He straightened his jacket with the reflexive precision that she had already come to recognize as habitual, the small adjustment that he made when shifting from one mode to another. "There are some things we'll need to discuss," he said. "When you're ready. About what happens next. Your father's situation, your accommodations, the position here if you want it. None of it is contingent on anything. It's a set of things I'd like to offer. You can say no to any of it." Nzi looked at him. "What's the position?" "A role that doesn't exist yet because I haven't needed it before," he said. looking after my mother, not as staff, something closer to a presence, someone she trusts, who understands what she needs, someone who finds her before she's frightened. Rosie was quiet for a moment. "I have a mum of my own," she said. "Back in Thunder Bay, she has her own situation." "I know," Julian said. "That's already being handled, if you'll allow it." He blinked. "You looked into my family." Adored. "I look into everything." He said it without apology, without softness. But the intent was not surveillance. It was because I needed to know what it would take to make this viable for you, and I wasn't willing to assume. Studied his face. He was not flinching under the study. He looked back at her with the same steady, deliberate attention he had given her since the solarium floor, the attention of someone who had decided, very quietly and without announcement, that she was worth looking at. "Give me a couple of days to think," she said. "Of course," Julian said. He moved toward the door. "Julian," she said. He stopped. He didn't know exactly what she was going to say before she said it, which was unusual. She had always been a person who thought before speaking, who weighed things first, whose caution came from long habit and necessity. "Thank you," she said, "for the water, on the floor that night. I don't think you know how much that mattered." He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she watched something pass through his expression. Not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been waiting a long time for a place to land. "Yeah, you took a strike meant for my mother," he said quietly. "And you told me the truth when you didn't have to. There is nothing on this earth I wouldn't do for that." Left. Rosie sat in the winter light of the recovery suite with the glass of water on the table beside her and the quiet of the estate settling around the room like a held breath. And she thought about Thunder Bay and her mum and the NDA she'd signed in a lobby 2 months ago without knowing what she was walking into. Thought about a woman in a black dress who had looked at her across a crowded room and seen something the room had missed entirely. Thought about what it meant to be found, not rescued, not fixed, not remade into something more convenient, but simply found in the place you already were, and told that you were worth the looking. Came on quietly through the vents. Outside, the first snow of December was coming down over the Vance estate, in long, slow curtains, covering the grounds in white, softening the old stone of the walls, making the whole world outside the window look, just for a moment, like something that could start over. Flanagan picked up the glass of water and drank. "I keep coming back to the moment Rosie didn't make a decision. That's the part that stays with me. She didn't weigh the consequences or calculate the odds. She just moved, wide, heavy, completely unplanned, and put herself between something cruel and someone who couldn't protect herself. And I think that's worth sitting with, because we live in a world that tells us the people most worth listening to are the ones who speak loudest, who stand straightest, who take up the least space and cause the least inconvenience. Rosie was none of those things, and she was the only person in that entire estate who did what needed to be done. There's something about the way she found Elise that I can't stop thinking about either. She didn't have a job description that included wandering the halls looking for a confused older woman. She had trays to carry and a uniform that didn't quite fit, and 2 past-due notices waiting at home. But she'd been watching all evening, quietly, without calling attention to it, because she recognized something in Elise that other people in that room had learned to look past. That kind of seeing, the kind that costs you nothing but attention, is rarer than we admit. It requires you to stay genuinely curious about other people, even when your own life is heavy enough to keep your eyes on the ground. Rosie kept looking up anyway. That's not a small thing. And then there's what happened to Vera. Not the dramatic part, but the quieter reality underneath it. She had access, proximity, a plan, and people who trusted her positioning. She had every structural advantage. What she didn't have was the one thing Rosie had in surplus, the simple, unglamorous commitment to doing right by someone who needed her. Vera treated Elise as an obstacle. Rosie treated her like a person. Of that difference, that fundamental difference in how they each decided other people's dignity mattered, is what unraveled everything Vera had built. You don't need to believe in fate or cosmic justice to understand that the way we treat the most vulnerable people in a room eventually tells everyone in that room exactly who we are. I think about the part where Julian comes back with the glass of water and just sets it down without making a speech about it. No performance, no announcement, just the recognition that someone was thirsty and he could do something about that. After everything that happened that night, that detail is the one that makes me believe the rest of it. Character isn't what we do when people are watching. It's what we reach for when we're already in motion and the choice is small enough that no one would notice either way. Rosie spent years making herself smaller in rooms that didn't make space for her. She carried laundry and kept her head down, and told herself endurance was enough, and maybe it was for a while. But what actually changed her life wasn't patience. It was the moment she stopped calculating what it would cost her to act and just acted. And willingness to do that, to move towards someone else's need, even when you're already exhausted and out of place, and certain that no one is watching. That's not luck. That's the quietest and most durable kind of strength there is. I hope you carry a little of that out of this story with you today.